This episode of Q Point Podcast is pre-recorded, produced and sponsored by Karina Quirk, broker at Next Home Experience.
Different views.
I know your story.
From different Q's.
Incredible job.
He's David Quirk.
You brought it up.
And she's Karina Quirk.
Imagine.
This is
Q Point.
Thank you for joining us for part 2 with Democratic candidate for United States Senate, Graham Platner.
So when you're out on the campaign trail, you keep saying tax the rich, tax the rich.
Yep.
So what does that mean to you? What do you consider as being rich?
So right now, there are a number of policies that already exist, certainly in the Senate. Elizabeth Warren has a few. There's a billionaire minimum tax that I really like, which essentially is everything over $1 billion gets taxed at a higher rate. I also think it's important that we tax wealth. So right now, there's this problem where a lot of very wealthy people, they have no income, but they borrow against their wealth. So if you're a billionaire, you just get to go to a bank and borrow money against your assets. But your assets can't get taxed, but you also aren't getting taxed on the money you're being loaned. So it's this ability to completely subvert. In my opinion, is if you're borrowing against your assets to have liquidity to expend in your life, those assets should be taxed. And we don't right now, because the way it works is capital gains only happens when you sell something. Yeah, right. I think at a certain level, and I would put this, we're getting into like the hundreds of millions of dollars realm. At a certain level, wealth above that, even if it's just sitting there needs to be some low percent, 2-3%, some kind of small surcharge on it, because that also incentivizes people not to hoard. That incentivizes people to expend their money in the economy, which I actually think is for a functioning economy to happen, we need money to be spent. It can't just sit there. I mean, that's what happened in the 1920s. The money just sat in people's bank accounts for a long time. They hoarded wealth. And when that happens, everything else begins to collapse. So when I talk about taxing the rich, one, I'm talking about the ultra rich. I don't want to see taxes go up on people that just run a successful business. That's ridiculous. Often, this conversation gets framed like that's what we're asking for. And it is used by the people who don't want to pay their fair share as a way of turning a lot of us down here in the real world against each other. And I think it's fundamental to understand that when we talk about going after wealth inequality in this country, we're not talking about people who run a successful car dealership. We're not talking about somebody that runs a successful oyster farm. We're talking about people who essentially live in a different plane of existence. The multinational corporation, tech company, billionaire world, they don't live in our world. But that's where all the money is at this point. When I talk about taxing the rich, that's who we're going after.
In your conversations around the state, are you also hearing frustration from Mainers who feel they are being taxed too heavily by state government?
Yeah, this is why I'm running for U.S. Senate. People often ask me, you don't have any experience, you never did anything before. Why are you going to run for U.S. Senate, something so big? And the reason is that because over, frankly, many decades, we've seen the federal government really kind of abdicate its role. We've put so much burden on states and municipalities to make up the difference. The problem is for rural states, Maine's a poor state. We only have 1.4 million people. We don't have a lot of money here. And to put the burden of infrastructure building, the burden of healthcare, the burden of education, purely on municipalities, counties, and states, that drives up tax rates on working people. Because the federal government, I think, is the only effective place to go after all that hoarded wealth, all that higher wealth, the corporate wealth, the billionaire wealth. States can't do that. Maine can't go get Amazon to pay higher taxes. We could try, but then Amazon just won't deliver things here because we're a small state with not a lot of power in that realm. I want to see tax rates on working people go down. I also want to see people's monthly expenditures go down because we start giving them the basic support like healthcare that we fund via taking money from the corporate interests. And that is a way in which we reduce both the tax burden on working people and middle-class people. We also kind of reduce their expenditures. They get to have extra money, which I think is good for small businesses. It's good for local economies. But the reason we often find ourselves in a state like Maine having to raise taxes is because the federal government has abdicated its role in supporting states. There was a time in this country when we built much of the infrastructure that exists today, but it was done with federal dollars. That frees states up to lower tax rates. It frees states up to spend their money on different things. And I just think that that is one of the roles of the federal government. It's not necessarily to direct spending, but it's to provide resources, certainly for like small rural states like Maine. Personally, I would very much like to see investment from the federal level into a state like Maine, and then let communities spend the money. And communities know what they need. Allocate the money along the lines of this is for education. We obviously have to set specific ground rules so things don't get abused. But I think when you provide that, that's when you actually get to see a diminishment in taxes at the state level, because the state that doesn't really have the capacity or the tax base to do what we expect it to, it now has help. But we have stopped doing that for a long time. And I think that's one of the major reasons we see. I think having good roads is important. I think having good schools is important. I think protecting our industries, like our lumber industry, our farming industry, obviously our fisheries and aquaculture. I'm a little biased on that one. These are things that I want the state to be putting resources into and building infrastructure to protect. But to do that, you do have to levy taxes. You have to have some form of income for the state. And I think that the role of the federal government really should be to take a lot of that burden off of working people. Because right now, that's why we have some of the highest taxes, because we don't actually have a big tax base. It's an irony. When you don't have a lot of wealthy people to pay higher taxes, you got to raise the taxes on everybody because you still want to pave the roads. Well, I want that. Some people might disagree, but I think having that kind of basic infrastructure is important. But we've created a system in which we put all the burden on states and municipalities. That's what raises property taxes. That's what raises income taxes at the state level. And I think there's an answer here. But the answer is looking at the federal government as a mechanism of supporting states, actually supporting them, not just kind of leaving them to their own devices. And it doesn't mean directing, but it does mean supporting.
You are listening to Q Point Podcast. I'm Karina Quirk, co-hosting with my husband, David Quirk, and we are having a conversation with Democratic candidate for United States Senate, Graham Platner.
So where do you stand on the commercial fishermen and all the regulations?
One of the reasons I became more politically active was because of working on the ocean. I think the Maine lobster industry, the Maine fishing industry in general, should be used worldwide as a model of how fishing should be conducted. We have this wonderful industry in Maine in which the people that do the work are the ones that make the money. And we have that because we have regulations, which is you have one boat, one captain, one license, maximum 800 traps, and the captain needs to be aboard for fishing to be conducted. The result has been zero corporate consolidation on the harvesting front. When you look at every other fishery on the East Coast of the United States, they went with different models. And they've seen bigger boats, smaller crews, consolidation of ownership, fleets in which the guys that fish actually have no ownership of the fleet itself. They're just paying into, and these days it's mostly owned by like multinationals in Spain or Portugal. Here in Maine, we don't have any of that. And we don't have it because we wrote smart regulations decades ago that have essentially made it impossible for any kind of consolidation of ownership to happen. And the real benefit to this is that it means that the money that gets made here, it's made by people that live here. The Maine lobster industry is, depending on how you want to do the math, but around $500 million a year industry with no corporate ownership. Point to me any other industry in the United States at this point in history where something worth that much money is still just run by the people that do the work. So I'm very protective of the Maine lobster industry. The struggles that they've been facing, especially on, I might get in trouble on this one, but the regulatory things coming down from the feds over the past few years have been onerous on the lobstermen. Changing out gear color, changing out rope color. And I'm sorry, like as somebody that works with a lot of rope on the ocean, people that don't work on the ocean, they're like, oh, just change it to a different color. We're talking about tens of thousands of dollars here. These are massive investments. And then you also got to spend all winter redoing all your gear. Frig. This is not like simple stuff. And in many ways, a lot of that came from what I think is not very good regulations that were based on some unsound science. I'm very much a conservationist, and I'm definitely an environmentalist. I make my living on the sea. I want the sea to be healthy. Without it, we don't get to do any of this. The Gulf of Maine is a uniquely special resource. But the state of Maine and the industry together have worked for decades to come up with, I think, a very effective regulatory model. And this is one of these moments where I'm not anti-regulation. I think good regulation is important. I am anti-bad regulation. And this is, for me, an example of where some of those regulatory structures do not reflect the reality of the industry. And we need to have a much more open dialogue between what the regulations are and what the industry sees. I also think, I'm just going to take this opportunity to say this. This is why I'm a firm believer in long-term industrial policy. We as a nation, as a state, we need to figure out what are the industries that we want in this country? What are the things that we can do most effectively on the global market? And then we should figure out ways to incentivize them. And my example of this is here in Maine, we have essentially no more fish processing. There's some people still pick lobster and pick crab, but it's all on like small kind of boutique levels. And even when it's not boutique, it's still pretty small. The reason for this is the Canadians subsidized their processing back in the 70s and 80s, and we couldn't keep up. They put government money into that industry. And today, Canada, that's where our lobsters get processed. They get shipped out of this state. That was a choice that was made by the Canadian government, but they did it because they knew what they wanted to do. We've stopped thinking like that on the national level, and I think on the state level in some ways. We need to return to that kind of more strategic thinking around our economy and around our industries. And I always use our fishery as an example of one, how it should look, the way that we do regulations around harvesting. That's an example of why I think that sort of model is effective. But we also have the example of the opposite, which is we lost all of our processing capability. And we lost it because we didn't subsidize it. The Canadians did, and our businesses could not compete. So we've lost it. It's a very simple proposition. So I'm a firm proponent of looking at our oceans as a resource that we need to figure out how to harness in a sustainable and effective manner. We've done that with the lobster industry. Despite what some people think, the health of the lobsters is good. We're not fishing them out. And we're not fishing them out because we built this, in many ways, very inefficient harvesting model, which is a bunch of small boats that drive around. We could wipe all the lobsters out probably in a week if we just sent out like a bunch of massive fleets. But we don't do that, and we don't want to, because we want an industry that's going to stick around for a long time. I want us to take that same kind of thinking around our oceans when it comes to food production, when it comes to production for things that we can use both as food additives. I think often about seaweed and kelp. I'm a big kelp fan. We know how to grow it. We know how to process it. The problem is that we have not put resources into it to figure out how to use it on a big scale. And my example here is what happened with corn. After World War II, America grew a lot of corn so we could feed the world that had been ravaged by a world war. Nobody burned our cornfields. Problem is once the rest of the world got its food production back online, we had a lot of farmers who'd been growing corn, and we didn't want to lose that capability. So we subsidized it. We grew a lot of corn that nobody ate. Because nobody ate it, a bunch of people started to figure out, what are we going to do with it? And we invented ethanol, and we invented corn syrup. We invented all these things. Now, I'm not going to say that these are necessarily good in the long run, but what they were is because we had a surplus of something, a lot of people put energy into figuring out, how do we make money off of this? How do we use this in an effective way? And I often think if we looked at the sea with that kind of thinking in mind, like when we grow kelp, we're not putting things into the ocean. We're not putting pesticides or fertilizer. We're not really changing. We're merely extracting from the sea the nutrients that feed this naturally growing thing. We're just growing it on purpose. And it's a carbon sink. Same with shellfish. I could go on about bivalves all day long. I love talking about oysters, mussels, and clams. But these are all things that, for me, this is an example of how in the state of Maine is uniquely suited going into the future to be a leader around how we use our seas and how we use our small farms here on land. Right now, the wood products industry in Maine is fascinating. We have people working on building materials, how to use wood to make carbon fiber through really intense processes of burning it and then extract. I mean, the whole thing is incredible. That's where we need to be putting our resources and our energy. But the only way that we're going to do that, I think, long term is by electing people who want to do this, who really do have a long-term commitment to building out an economy and an industry here in the United States that is strategic in fashion. We want to make sure that we're doing something that's going to benefit all of us. And we forgot how to think like this. And I honestly think one of our biggest problems in politics today is a failure of imagination. What's frustrating is that we used to think like this as a nation. We used to have leaders that did do this kind of work and thought in this way. But in the past 40 years or so, we've been electing people who are so short-sighted. and I think invested only in themselves and their own power. We need to get away from that. We need to start electing people who want to think long term and big picture in very imaginative ways about how we're going to face the challenges of the future.
If elected to the U.S. Senate, which committees would you be seeking to serve on?
Whoever replaces Susan Collins, and somebody's eventually going to have to replace Susan Collins, we're going to lose the gavel on appropriations. And whoever replaces her, I think it is incumbent upon them to want to go work on appropriations to rebuild that power over time. I also think that it's important that we elect people who have a commitment and the time to rebuild that kind of power. Senator Collins on appropriations has been good for the state of Maine. And that's why when we lose her, whoever it is to replace really needs to be focused on using small states like ours, appropriations key. Also, I believe in the power of the purse. As we've talked about today, clearly spending, I think from the federal level is fairly important to me. So appropriations is an important place, both for the state, but also I think nationally, how we're going to think about allocating resources. Also commerce and agriculture and labor, healthcare committee. Obviously, my commitment to healthcare is fairly clear. But commerce and ag, for a state like Maine, that's where we're going to do that long-term strategic industrial policy, or in those places. It's funny, people often think I want to go to like armed services or intelligence or something like that. And because of my background, I've had enough of that. And I also think that in my critique of our political system is far more based around how our economy functions than anything else. And I think those are the committees where you can do the most work around those issues.
Have you been following the alleged Medicaid overbilling at Gateway Community Services?
Yeah, I have.
What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's a two-part thing. On the bigger picture, things like Medicaid fraud exist all over. They are extensive. They happen all the time. In fact, if you look up Rick Scott down in Florida, who is now a United States Senator, but he oversaw one of the largest issues of Medicaid and Medicare fraud in American history. Now he's a U.S. Senator. This stuff happens all the time. I think it's actually a issue of the fact that we have this convoluted medical system with insurance companies and providers and all of this. It's so arcane and Byzantine, it opens itself up to fraud, which is why I'm a big fan of a single-payer healthcare system, which takes all of that confusing stuff out of it. The other thing is fraud is illegal, and when it happens, it needs to be investigated and prosecuted. And at the moment, I will just wait to see what investigations and prosecutions bring about. We are in a political era where I think these stories pop up and they get a lot of visibility due to other political considerations. Like I said, Medicaid fraud happens all the time in the United States, and we never hear about it. But suddenly, in this situation, a lot of folks are talking about it. It's in the news. It's a big deal. And thus far, I have not seen any law enforcement element to it. And when that happens, I hope if fraud is committed, it is investigated, it is prosecuted, and that money is pulled back, and the people that commit fraud are punished. To me, that's a fairly simple thing to reach. But I also think it's important to note that until we see true investigations and actual things, there's a lot of innuendo at the moment, and I'm just not one that deals in innuendo.
Do you support local and state law enforcement?
Of course. That's how we keep our communities safe. In fact, right now, it's one of the reasons why I have some serious criticisms of certain federal law enforcement organizations like ICE, which I don't actually think are doing a great job of keeping communities safe. Local law enforcement lives in the community it serves. Maine State Police are incredibly effective and professional. I've never had anything but a good relationship with them over the years. Same with the DMR, Marine Patrol. I have a soft spot in my heart for the Marine Patrol. But that's also because we in Maine, I think, still have a mindset around this stuff as being, it's there to protect our communities. In many ways, at the federal level, we need to return to that kind of mindset around law enforcement, not using it as a political tool, which sadly I think is happening right now.
You are listening to Q Point Podcast. I'm Karina Quirk, co-hosting with my husband, David Quirk, and we are having a conversation with Democratic candidate for United States Senate, Graham Platner.
So I do got to congratulate you on the signatures in your fourth quarter raising of money.
Thank you. To get on the ballot in Maine, you have to collect a certain number of signatures. It's 2,000. You can submit up to 2,500 because some signatures often won't count. Somebody maybe will have signed who's not a registered Democrat, or somebody gets their address wrong, something like that. So you want to submit good signatures. So you usually will go over with the understanding that of that, you'll be able to find enough to submit to the state and get on the ballot. My field director set a very, I would say, aggressive goal of 5,000 signatures in 4 days. Starting on January 1st, we're going to finish that Sunday. We hit 2,000 by day 2. We hit over 5,000 by day 3 on Saturday. And by the time all was said and done, we collected around 7,000 signatures in 4 days. In the middle of a snowstorm. The most important part to me is that it was done by volunteers. This is usually a thing that's done by paid people. And we had 700 volunteers turn out over the state to collect those signatures.
That's incredible.
I fundamentally believe the only way we're going to fix our political system is by rebuilding it from the ground up, is by getting people involved, by people building relationships and trust in their communities again. It's the only way this is going to work. So it was very heartening to me that many Mainers turned out in the middle of a snowstorm to go knock on doors, talk to their neighbors, and get signatures, and begin to realize that they do actually have a significant amount of power when they're organized and when they're working together. When I got into this thing at the beginning, back in August, I was just some random guy from Sullivan with no political background and, at the time, really no interest. I've not been living a life setting me up to be a U.S. senator, as the New York Times will always love to point out. But the reason I got into it is I'm not seeing the politics I think is necessary to get through the polarization and the divisiveness and to get back to a system that actually represents people. That was the whole point. So to watch that actually happen has been incredibly humbling, but also it gives me so much hope at a time in which a lot of people are feeling a lot of despair.
As part of your campaign, do you feel that you are bringing together Republicans, Democrats, and everyone in between?
Yeah, especially when I actually get to talk to people. Both parties, the whole political apparatus, is very displeased with our campaign. Right now, my biggest fight is with the Democratic Party, which in Washington, D.C. has made it very clear. They're mad at me because I didn't ask their permission, which is insane. Anybody should be able to run for office in the state they're in, which means it also comes with the support of a media apparatus. And as you know, many people have probably seen me in the news in very negative ways. I often get portrayed as this bomb-throwing radical. I don't think anything I'm saying is radical at all. I think this is all actually pretty fundamentally normal. As I go around the state and talk to people, again, across the political spectrum, you really do begin to realize that all of our material needs down here in the real world, they're pretty much the same. If the hospital closes, it doesn't matter who you voted for. It doesn't matter what's on your registration. The hospital closed. If small businesses in your community are disappearing because our economy is no longer built for them, that hurts everybody. And I think people are beginning to feel that. And when I get to talk to folks, and they're dealing with me as a person, not as this fantasy that's cooked up by the media apparatus, that always works, which is one of the reasons why we are so committed to running a very old school campaign. I've held almost 40 town halls around the state. Everybody gets to come. I make myself very accessible to people. And also those town halls, we don't screen questions. I just pick on people in the crowd, which terrifies my comms people. Because they're like, what if we get a bad one? I'm like, that's the whole point. The point is to talk to people you disagree with. And I think there's an element of it where it works because I live in Sullivan. I grew up in Sullivan. I live in rural eastern Maine. It's where I'm from. There are a lot of people where we don't see eye to eye on everything politically, and yet we're still friends. We hang out, we drink beer together, we talk, we argue, but at its core, we still kind of agree on a lot of stuff. And I have found that when you have those direct conversations, when you really connect with people, that's where you find that still. We have a lot of Republicans come to town halls and ask questions, and then at the end of it be like, oh, I see. You're not at all what I expected. Again, we can agree to disagree on some stuff, but I think on the core issues around the fact that our entire political system is owned by corporations now, I think most people are pretty mad about that. And it's been thus far very successful. I'm just going to keep going around and talking to everybody I can.
Before we let you go, David brought it up, your fourth quarter numbers. Why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, so we raised about $5 million in our fourth quarter, which now brings our total fundraising haul to a little over $8 million since we launched back in August. These numbers to me are essentially incomprehensible. I make between $50,000 and $60,000 a year with my wife when I hear people in the finance team talking about we pulled in $400,000 the other day. I'm like, that's 5 years of income for me. It's very strange. Doing this as a regular person is a very surreal experience. What's cool, though, is that the vast majority of that just comes from small donors. And almost all of it just comes from individual donors. Some people donate a lot of money to us, but it's just what they're allowed to. There's a cap on that. I fundamentally am against money in politics. What's really frustrating is that to get money out of politics in this system we have, you have to raise a bunch of money. And often that results, I think, in people who might even agree with that concept, but fundraising is hard. and they don't want to do it. And so you sometimes maybe just agree to a corporate PAC who simply says, hey, don't go taxing us or change some regulation that's good for our industry. And if you do that, we'll just give you a bunch of money. I refuse to do that because it's against my core political beliefs. But I also think like that's when the influence begins to creep in. And we can't have, that's the problem with our system. It's been an honor, frankly, to have so many people around Maine and around the country just donate $30, $40. We have a lot of people who are doing monthly recurring donations, which actually are more helpful for us because it allows us to see into the future. We know that we can meet payroll in April, which allows us to then all the money after that. We're like, okay, well, now we can put it into organizing. We can put it into more field-oriented operations. And it gives us the ability to plan. And to raise this much money, a lot of folks have over the past couple of days reached out. Actually, there's a very funny Instagram page called Stock the Capital. He rates politicians from A to F or A plus to F on how much money they take from corporate interests. And he did a video on us just the other day. He was like, hey, we saw how much money this guy raised. He's some random oyster farmer. So a lot of people are like, well, clearly he must be taking it from like corporate PACs. Well, he went through all of it. He went through all of our filings and he's like, nope. This guy takes only money from small dollar funds. The only time we do take money from PACs is if it's a small PAC that's affiliated with like a labor union or is affiliated with some, like an environmental group, some kind of group that I'm actually ideologically with. And also it doesn't come with any kind of strings. I refuse to take corporate PAC money. I refuse to take money from like those big dark money operations. We know where every dollar we get comes from. And if we don't know where it's coming from, we don't take it because I think that that's when you get that creeping influence. And yeah, what we've been able to pull off over the past few months, but in that last quarter, especially almost $5 million for taking nothing but small dollar donations, it's kind of unheard of in many ways.
If people want to get involved in your campaign, Graham, what's the best way for them to get involved?
So if you like what you hear and you want to support us, like I said, small dollar funding, that's the big one. So if you're willing to donate, honestly, as little as $1, all of it counts. GrahamForSenate.com, and there's a donate link there. More importantly, though, is if you want to like really learn how to do real politics, you want to get involved, you want to learn how to knock on doors, you want to learn how to organize, that's where we're putting all of our resources. We have 12,000 volunteers. And if you want to join that, if you want to join this kind of volunteer army that we're building, go to the same website, GrahamForSenate.com, and sign up to volunteer. We have a lot of volunteer options. It's not just door knocking, text banking, phone calling, but we also have people who are doing things like research. If you have spreadsheet skills and you want to donate a little bit of time, we can always use it. We're trying to figure out ways to incorporate everybody that wants to get involved. Because for me, it's not just about like winning this Senate race. It's about really re-engaging Mainers with politics and getting them organized and trained in many ways on how, when they work together, when all of us work together, we can build a lot of power down here in the real world. But it requires skills and it requires commitment. And if that's a thing that you'd like to do, please sign up and join our campaign.
Can people find your town hall schedule on your website as well?
Right now, we are planning out the next few months' events. So for me, it can be exhausting, but we're going to have another very robust list of events around the state of Maine. And please come on out and meet me in person and ask me questions, especially if you disagree with me. Those are the ones I prefer the most.
Democratic candidate for United States Senate, Graham Platner. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, no, thank you guys. I really appreciate the time today.
Thank you for taking all the time. We appreciate it. We know you got a busy schedule.
That's okay. This is well worth it.
You've been listening to Q Point.
Follow us at qpointpodcast.com or on your favorite streaming app.
This is where you can get the news from the people who make the news.
Make sure to join us next time.
We hope you tune in.
Q Point Podcast invites guests and candidates from all parties to join the conversation. The views, information, opinions, and comments expressed during this program do not necessarily represent those of the host, Q Point Podcast, associates, affiliates, and CQRE LLC.
Thanks for being a part of the conversation. The most important voices aren't always the loudest ones. They're the voices of everyday people, raising families, running businesses, serving their towns. That's who we want to hear from. Share your ideas with us online, and let's make sure those voices are never left out. Find us on Facebook or on X or at qpointpodcast.com. We look forward to hearing from you. Catch every episode at qpointpodcast.com or wherever you stream. Tune in and tell your friends.